Hello and welcome. Tonight, we step into a world where the sound of bells did not always mean joy, where vows were spoken not under the soft gaze of romance, but in the shadow of politics, property, and power. If you enjoy sinking into the strange and often unsettling truths of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you these long, immersive journeys into the past. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I always enjoy seeing how many different corners of the map gather here when we step into these stories together. Now, weddings in the Middle Ages were nothing like the soft-focus fairy tales painted by modern films. They were not just about love. In fact, love was rarely the point. A medieval wedding was often a transaction, an alliance sealed between families, sometimes arranged before the bride and groom had even met. And yet, despite the cold logic behind them, these unions were wrapped in layers of symbolism, superstition, and ritual so thick that even those who felt trapped by them could not escape their weight. Imagine the setting. The year is 1374. The village is small. The church bell has been rung not to gather people in joy, but to summon them to witness a legal bond that will affect property lines, family alliances, and even the local economy. The bride, often little more than a teenager, stands beside her groom, who might be twice her age, both dressed in their finest clothes. But here, finest is not always white lace and flowers. A medieval bride's dress might be deep red, gold, or even black, dyed with colors that signaled wealth, not purity. White would not become the standard until centuries later. Around them, the guests are not only friends and family, but local leaders, landowners, and church representatives, each watching with an interest that has little to do with romance. And the ceremony itself? In many places, the church was not yet the mandatory site of marriage. Vows could be exchanged at the church door, before witnesses, with the priest blessing the union afterward. Sometimes, the couple would clasp hands over the church threshold, symbolizing the bridge between two households. Rings existed, but not always. Many grooms would place a token, sometimes a coin or even a piece of cloth, into the bride's hand to signify the sealing of the contract. Music played a part, but not always the way we think. Village musicians might strike up tunes on bagpipes, fiddles, or drums, but the songs could be bawdy, full of innuendo meant to bless the couple with fertility. And that word fertility was central. A medieval wedding was less about the couple's happiness and more about the assurance of heirs. To that end, the wedding feast would often feature symbolic foods: almonds for prosperity, eggs for fertility, and spiced wine to warm the body and encourage closeness between the new spouses. But beyond the feast lay rituals darker and stranger to modern eyes. In some regions, it was custom for the bride and groom to be escorted to their bed by a crowd of guests, who would watch or even participate in certain symbolic acts meant to prove the marriage had been consummated. Privacy was rare, and the pressure of community expectation was immense. Superstition wrapped itself tightly around the day. A bride might carry herbs like rosemary or rue to ward off evil spirits that could harm her future children. Iron objects were sometimes tucked into her clothing to keep away witches believed to curse newlyweds. The choice of day was vital. Marrying on certain saints' days was thought to bring luck, while others were avoided entirely for fear of inviting misfortune. Even the weather was read as an omen. Rain might be seen as a blessing in one village, a curse in another. Yet within all these constraints, moments of genuine joy could bloom. A stolen glance between the couple, a shared laugh over a spilled drink, the warm press of hands under the table, small human moments that defied the weight of obligation. And in some rare unions, affection grew from these beginnings, turning arranged matches into true partnerships. But for many, the wedding day was the start of a long negotiation between personal will and the expectations of family, church, and community. As the last of the guests staggered home from the feast, as the candles burned low and the night closed in, the bride and groom were left alone, or as alone as medieval life ever allowed, standing at the threshold of a life shaped as much by tradition as by their own choices. And that is only the surface. Because when we peel back the layers of custom and ceremony, we find a world where marriage was a tool, a weapon, and sometimes a cage. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk deeper into the rituals themselves, the strange laws that governed who could marry whom, and the hidden meanings behind the songs, the dances, and the blessings. But now, hold that image of the medieval wedding in your mind not as a white-draped fantasy, but as a crossroads of love, law, and superstition, where every smile might hide a calculation, and every vow carried the weight of more than just two hearts. When we step further into the layers of a medieval wedding, what we find is not a single, unified tradition, but a patchwork of customs that could change drastically from one region to the next. In England, for example, a wedding might begin with what was called the handfasting, a symbolic binding of the couple's hands with a cord or strip of cloth, sometimes embroidered with symbols of their families. This was more than a gesture, it was the physical act of tying the knot, a phrase that survives to this day. In France, by contrast, the public reading of the marriage contract could take place days before the ceremony, and it was often done in the center of the village to ensure no one could later claim ignorance of the union's terms. In Germany, the tradition of the Brautlauf would see the bride symbolically chased, or even hidden by her friends before the groom had to find her, often after paying a small ransom in the form of drinks or coins. But no matter where the ceremony took place, the presence of witnesses was essential. Without witnesses, the marriage could be contested. And in a world where land, dowries, and inheritance were at stake, that was a risk no family wanted to take. The vows themselves varied as well. Some were spoken in Latin, the language of the church, others in the local tongue, so that all present could understand. And while the church increasingly pushed for weddings to be held inside its walls, older customs often lingered. Many couples still chose to exchange vows at the church door, a public space that symbolized openness and community acknowledgement. Once the vows were spoken, the celebrations began. And here is where the medieval wedding could transform from solemn formality into a chaotic, almost carnivalesque event. Musicians would lead processions from the church to the feast hall, their tunes loud enough to carry across the village. Children might run alongside, shouting blessings or teasing the couple. At the feast, the food served was both a display of wealth and a coded message. In noble households, entire roasted peacocks might be brought to the table, their feathers reattached after cooking to create an image of splendor and abundance. In humbler settings, there might be pies filled not with meat, but with small trinkets or sweets, hidden so that guests would stumble upon them with delight. And then there was the drinking ale, mead, and wine flowed freely, and toasts to the couple could become increasingly rowdy as the night wore on. It was not uncommon for playful competitions to be staged between guests, from dancing contests to wrestling matches, all meant to ensure the marriage began with strong energy. But woven into the laughter were older, more superstitious acts. In parts of Scotland, it was custom to blacken the bride and groom, smearing them with soot, ash, and feathers before the wedding, as a way to ward off evil spirits. In parts of Italy, loud noises, bells, drums, even the firing of small cannons were believed to scare away misfortune on the wedding day. In more rural parts of Europe, charms and blessings were stitched into the bride's clothing without her knowing, hidden between the seams or underlayers of fabric. As night fell, the transition to the bedding ceremony could be gentle or shockingly intrusive. In some regions, the newlyweds were led to their chamber by candlelight, accompanied by songs sometimes sweet, sometimes ribald. In others, the guests might actually follow them into the room, standing as witnesses while the couple lay together, ensuring the union was sealed in the eyes of the community. Privacy, as we know it, was a rare luxury. The bedding ceremony was not always literal. In many cases, it was more symbolic. But the public nature of it underscored how marriage was not just a personal relationship, it was a public contract, one that everyone present had a stake in. By morning, the wedding day's magic, if there had been any, was replaced by the reality of life ahead. The bride moved into her new home, sometimes far from her family, sometimes under the roof of her husband's parents, where her role was clearly defined. The groom, too, stepped into a life now bound not only to his wife, but to her family's fortunes and failures. And so the medieval wedding, for all its color, noise, and pageantry, was less a romantic culmination than the first step into a complex web of obligations. In this way, the medieval marriage ceremony was a mirror of the age itself, rich with spectacle, steeped in faith and superstition, and firmly rooted in the needs of the community over the desires of the individual. And now we come to the part of medieval weddings that often escapes the polished retellings, the cues slides. Storms so strange, so deeply rooted in superstition or local law, that they can seem almost unbelievable to modern ears. One of the most striking of these was the concept of charivari, a noisy, mocking procession that could erupt if the community disapproved of the match. Imagine it. The couple, perhaps newly married, is woken at night by a mob of villagers banging pots, blowing horns, shouting crude songs, all to shame them. This could happen if there was a large age gap, if the marriage was seen as unbalanced in wealth or status, or even if it was simply unpopular. The idea was that public noise could correct an inappropriate union by humiliating it into submission. Then there were customs aimed at ensuring fertility in ways that now seem invasive. In some regions, the bride's stockings would be stolen by guests during the feast, and the groom was expected to retrieve them from under the table without using his hands, to the cheers and laughter of all present. In others, a child would be placed in the newlyweds' bed before the couple themselves entered it, a symbolic blessing meant to ensure children would come quickly. There were also territorial displays that blended legal symbolism with raw physicality. In certain German towns, the groom would chop wood or perform a feat of strength in front of witnesses to prove he could provide for his household. In parts of rural France, the bride might spin flax or weave a small cloth in the days after her wedding, presenting it publicly to show her skill as a homemaker. And then, we find the strange mixture of violence and festivity that sometimes marked the celebrations. It was not unheard of for guests to pelt the couple with grain or nut, symbols of prosperity, but in some places, these were thrown with such force that injuries were possible. In a few recorded cases, the custom escalated to tossing sharp or hard objects, with the belief that enduring pain on the wedding day would shield the couple from greater suffering in life. Religious symbolism intertwined with superstition at every turn. The couple might be sprinkled with holy water not only inside the church, but again at the threshold of their home, as if to cleanse them from any ill fortune that might have followed from the feast. In certain Italian villages, it was thought unlucky for the bride to cross the threshold of her new home without being carried over it, not for romance, but to prevent malevolent spirits from clinging to her feet. In some parts of Scandinavia, knives or small iron tools were placed under the marriage bed to protect against curses. And beyond all the noise and spectacle, there were legal oddities. In medieval England, the concept of consent was complex. Marriages could be considered valid if the couple simply declared themselves wed in front of witnesses, even without a priest. This loophole led to clandestine marriages, which the church fought to suppress. Meanwhile, in parts of Central Europe, if a marriage was not consummated within a certain number of days, it could be annulled, no matter how elaborate the wedding had been. But perhaps the most haunting custom was the idea of the mourning wedding, a practice reserved for times when one of the betrothed died before the ceremony. In some cases, the surviving partner would go through with a symbolic wedding to the deceased, sometimes standing beside their coffin, in order to secure inheritance rights or honor a family agreement. It is a reminder that marriage in the medieval world was as much about duty as desire, and that the rituals surrounding it could bend to serve necessity, even in the face of death. These customs, strange as they seem now, reveal something essential about medieval life. that marriage was not just a personal union, but a public event, a legal contract, and a spiritual gamble all at once. Every act, from the throwing of nuts to the smearing of soot, carried a weight of meaning, binding the couple not just to each other, but to the entire community. And it is within these traditions, some joyous, some unsettling, that we glimpse the true texture of the medieval wedding, far removed from the sanitized visions of modern romance. Preparation for a medieval wedding did not begin with flowers and gowns. It began with negotiations, alliances, and often months or even years of planning. In the noble classes, the wedding could be the endpoint of a political arrangement made long before the bride and groom were even old enough to understand what marriage meant. Families would meet to draft the marriage contract, a document that spelled out dowries, land transfers, and inheritance rights in painstaking detail. The dowry was not simply a gift, it was a calculated investment, a sign of the family's wealth and commitment to the alliance. For a noblewoman, her dowry might include coin, fine cloth, livestock, and even entire villages, while in merchant or farming families, it might be smaller but still vital, a few acres of land, tools, or a portion of the harvest. Choosing the wedding day was another layer of strategy. The church forbade weddings during certain periods of the liturgical calendar, most notably during Lent and Advent, so families had to work within the available dates. Astrology also played a role. In some places, the alignment of the stars was consulted to ensure the marriage would be prosperous. The preparation of the venue could vary wildly depending on social class. A noble wedding might be held inside a cathedral or a grand hall hung with banners and tapestries, while a peasant wedding might take place at the village church or even in a field blessed by the local priest. Regardless of status, the place had to be cleansed, sometimes literally. In parts of Eastern Europe, the ground where the vows would be spoken was swept and sprinkled with salt to ward off evil spirits. Then came the matter of clothing. The idea of a white wedding dress is a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, brides wore their best garments, often in rich colors like deep blue, red, or gold. For the wealthy, these were made of velvet or silk and lined with fur in winter months. For commoners, linen and wool were the norm, but care was taken to embellish the clothing with embroidery, ribbons, or borrowed jewelry to mark the occasion. The groom, too, dressed to impress, sometimes wearing a tunic in the colors of his family's coat of arms, or donning a new belt or cloak gifted by his bride's family. In some regions, both bride and groom wore crowns or wreaths. In Scandinavia, the bride's crown could be made of metal, decorated with ornate designs, and sometimes with small charms dangling to jingle as she moved. In Slavic countries, floral wreaths held symbolic herbs to protect against misfortune. Even the food for the feast was prepared with intention. Certain dishes were thought to bring luck: roast meats for strength, bread for prosperity, and sweet pastries for happiness. Spices, if available, were used liberally, not just for flavor, but as a display of wealth, since cinnamon, cloves, and saffron had to be imported at great cost. Days before the wedding, the brewing of ale or mead would begin, ensuring there was enough to flow freely for all guests. Then came the more mystical side of preparation: rituals and charms meant to guard the couple from harm. In some places, the bride's hair was combed by a married woman of good fortune to pass her luck on to the younger woman. In others, a piece of iron was sewn into the hem of the bride's dress to repel evil. The groom might carry a small token, perhaps a carved wooden charm or a piece of wolf's tooth, as a sign of strength and protection. Invitations, in the modern sense, did not exist. Instead, word of the wedding spread through the community, and it was often expected that the entire village or town would attend, whether they had been formally asked or not. This made weddings large, public affairs opportunities not just for celebration, but for networking, trade, and even matchmaking among guests. In the final hours before the ceremony, the air would be thick with expectation. The streets or paths leading to the venue would be swept clean, sometimes strewn with herbs whose scents were meant to please both people and the divine. Musicians would tune their instruments, cooks would prepare the first platters, and children would peek from doorways to catch the first glimpse of the bride. The wedding was not yet underway, But in these moments before it began, the medieval world seemed to hold its breath, suspended between ordinary life and the weight of the vows to come. The medieval wedding ceremony itself was a carefully orchestrated blend of religious doctrine, local custom, and social theater, and though the church sought to standardize it across Christendom, regional variations kept it vibrant and unpredictable. For most of the Middle Ages, the vows were not exchanged inside the church, but just outside its doors, on the porch, or in the churchyard, in view of the community. This was symbolic. Marriage was both a sacred bond and a public contract, and so it was sealed in the sight of God and neighbor alike. The priest would begin with a blessing, invoking the authority of the church to sanctify the union. The couple would be asked if they came of their own free will, a question that might seem straightforward, but could be politically charged in arranged marriages. Then came the exchange of vows, often spoken in the vernacular so all could hear and bear witness. In many places, the vows were simple and direct promises to take one another as husband and wife, to love, honor, and keep each other in sickness and in health, until death parted them. Rings, when used, were usually worn by the bride alone, and often on the right hand rather than the left. In some regions, instead of a ring, the groom would give the bride a symbolic token, perhaps a coin, a piece of cloth, or a belt representing his commitment and his ability to provide. Once the vows were spoken, the priest would bless the union and sometimes wrap his stole around the couple's joined hands, a gesture that survives in the modern hand-fasting tradition. In certain areas, a ceremonial kiss would seal the marriage, but in others, this was replaced with the couple drinking from the same cup of blessed wine. After the vows, the couple would enter the church for the nuptial mass. Here, they might kneel together before the altar while prayers were said for their fertility, prosperity, and harmony. The Eucharist would be offered, sometimes with the couple sharing a single piece of consecrated bread to symbolize their unity. In wealthier weddings, special music or chanting might accompany the Mass, and incense would fill the air with its heavy, sweet smoke, mingling with the winter chill or the summer's warmth. The conclusion of the ceremony was marked not with quiet solemnity, but with an explosion of sound and color. Bells would ring from the church tower, signaling to the entire village that a new household had been formed. In some places, flower petals or fragrant herbs would be scattered over the couple as they emerged, while in others, guests might toss grains of wheat or barley, symbols of fertility and abundance. There were also more mischievous customs. Children might block the path with ropes or branches, forcing the groom to pay a toll in coins or sweets before passing, a playful reminder that marriage came with its own tests and negotiations. The procession from the church to the site of the feast was itself a spectacle. Musicians would lead the way with drums, flutes, or bagpipes, followed by the couple and their families, then the rest of the guests. In noble weddings, heralds might carry banners bearing the arms of both families, while in humbler celebrations, neighbors would carry lanterns, torches, or garlands of greenery. This public walk was not just a formality. It was a way of showing the strength of the alliance, the wealth of the families, and the joy of the community. Yet behind the joy was a deep current of seriousness. The vows spoken that day were binding in the eyes of God, and breaking them could have dire spiritual and social consequences. The church's presence in the ritual was not just about blessing, it was about control, ensuring that marriage served both moral order and social stability. As the couple reached the feast hall or the prepared space in the village, the mood would shift again, from sacred to celebratory. The guests would pour in, the first cups of ale or wine would be raised, and the long hours of eating, music, and dancing would begin. But the memory of that moment outside the church hands joined, vows spoken in the chill air would linger, an anchor for all that followed, both in the joy of the feast and in the trials of married life. The wedding feast in the Middle Ages was more than just a meal. It was a declaration of status, generosity, and community. A social performance meant to impress allies, bind families, and sometimes even intimidate rivals. For nobles, the feast could last for several days, with the great hall transformed into a scene of abundance. Long trestle tables lined with trenchers' thick slabs of stale bread used as plates piled high with roasted meats, fresh bread, and pastries. Servants moved constantly, carrying steaming platters of venison, boar, swan, or even peacock, its plumage reattached after roasting so it appeared in full glory when presented. These were not just for eating, they were theatrical centerpieces, proof of the host's wealth and reach. For Monfolk, the spread might be humbler but no less celebratory. Roasted chicken or pork, pottage thickened with oats or barley, freshly baked rye bread, and ale brewed specially for the occasion. In both settings, food was symbolic. Spices were sprinkled lavishly at wealthy tables, not just for taste, but to display the expense and prestige of having goods brought from distant lands. Honey was drizzled over pastries to signify sweetness in the marriage, and pies were sometimes baked with small charms inside, each carrying a fortune for the finder. Music filled the space lutes, fiddles, bagpipes, and drums weaving together lively tunes while jesters, jugglers, or storytellers entertained between courses. Dancing was inevitable, and while courtly dances among nobles followed prescribed steps and patterns, in village weddings the dancing could be wild and unrestrained, with circles forming and breaking in laughter. The bride and groom were often expected to lead the first dance, sometimes under a canopy held by guests, a gesture meant to bless their union. Drinking games and toasts were plentiful, and the couple would be encouraged to drink from a shared cup, symbolizing unity. In some traditions, guests would bang their cups or shout until the couple kissed, a practice that could happen repeatedly throughout the night. There were also rituals of a more intimate nature. In parts of France and England, the bedding ceremony involved leading the couple to their bedchamber amid teasing and laughter, with friends and family sometimes following to ensure the marriage was consummated, a practice as awkward as it was intrusive by modern standards. In more private customs, the bride might be quietly prepared for the night ahead by older married women who would comb her hair, help her change into a shift, and offer advice, blessings, or charms for fertility. Meanwhile, the groom might receive his own words of counsel from male relatives or friends, sometimes accompanied by symbolic gestures, a sword placed at the head of the bed for protection, or a loaf of bread broken to ensure abundance. In noble households, the bedding might be staged as a formal ritual, with witnesses present to attest to the marriage's validity. In peasant homes, it was often a matter of privacy, with the couple slipping away when the feast wound down. But even in the quietest cases, the consummation of the marriage was viewed as the true sealing of the vows, and without it, the union could be challenged or annulled. Outside the bedchamber, the celebration might continue until dawn, fires burning low, songs turning softer, and guests drifting home through the chill night air. The feast, for all its joy, was not just an ending, it was the opening chapter of the couple's new life, marked by the bonds of kinship, the promises of prosperity, and the watchful eyes of a community that would remember the day for years to come. By morning, the hall or yard would be littered with the remnants of abundance crumbs, empty cups, stray herbs from garlands, but in the minds of those who attended, the image of the bride and groom, united under blessings and surrounded by laughter, would remain vivid, carrying the weight of tradition into the seasons that followed. Beyond the familiar images of vows, feasts, and music, medieval weddings were layered with customs and beliefs that could seem strange, even baffling, to modern eyes, yet each had its place in the intricate web of symbolism that bound the ceremony together. Many of these traditions were rooted in a deep fear of misfortune on the wedding day. One of the most widespread was the belief that evil spirits were drawn to moments of great happiness, seeking to disrupt them. To ward off such forces, guests would create as much noise as possible, ringing bells, banging pots, shouting, or firing arrows into the air. This practice, sometimes called charivari, could take place on the wedding day itself or during the nights that followed, especially if the community suspected that the match had been made for reasons other than love. Another superstition revolved around timing. Marrying in May, for instance, was often avoided in England due to the belief that marry in May, rue for I, while in other regions, certain days of the week were considered more auspicious than others, with Wednesday often favored for noble weddings and Sunday for commoners. Clothing, too, carried layers of meaning. While white gowns became fashionable much later, medieval brides often wore their best dress, regardless of color, with red, blue, and green being popular choices. Blue symbolized purity and devotion, red signified fertility and passion, and green was tied to growth and prosperity. The garments might be adorned with embroidery, jewels, or fur, depending on the family's means, and a girdle or belt worn around the waist could symbolize both chastity and the binding together of the couple's lives. Veils were not universally worn, but they served as much to protect the bride from the evil eye as to signify modesty. The groom's attire was equally important, often mirroring the bride's in richness of fabric or color, signaling unity and shared fortune. Then there were the symbolic acts, woven into the day, some solemn, others playful. In certain regions, the couple would be required to step over a broom or a sword as part of the ceremony, the act representing the crossing from single to married life. In others, they would share bread and salt as a sign of hospitality, and the sustenance they would provide each other. Gifts exchanged between families could be as straightforward as livestock, land, or coin, or as curious as rare books, exotic spices, or elaborate hunting birds. These exchanges were not mere gestures, they were binding agreements, and the items themselves often carried stories and histories that linked the two families for generations. Music, too, could carry meaning beyond entertainment. Specific songs or melodies might be played to invoke blessings, recall ancestral glory, or even subtly mock rival families. In more rural settings, it was not unusual for songs to contain humorous or mildly scandalous verses, sung to provoke laughter and ease the formality of the occasion. Underneath all these customs ran the undercurrent of community involvement. A medieval marriage was not just a union between two individuals, it was a public contract that the entire village or town had a stake in. Guests bore witness not simply as friends or relatives, but as guarantors of the vows. They would remember who attended, who approved, and who stood apart, and these memories could influence alliances, disputes, and favors for years afterward. Even the smallest details, from the choice of flowers in the garlands to the number of courses served at the feast, would be noted, discussed, and remembered. For in the medieval mind, weddings were not just private joy, they were moments when the social order was displayed, affirmed, and in subtle ways, negotiated anew. Behind the smiles, the songs, and the shared cups of wine, many medieval weddings were in truth carefully engineered negotiations, where the language of romance often masked the language of power, property, and obligation. The marriage contract, whether formally written or spoken and witnessed, was the foundation upon which the union rested, and its terms could be as binding as any royal decree. Among the nobility, these contracts were intricate legal documents that could take weeks or months to finalize, with scribes, heralds, and clerics poring over every clause. They specified not only the dowry the bride would bring land, coin, livestock, or rights to certain incomes, but also the jointure or dower the groom promised in return, ensuring that the bride would have some security should she be widowed. In some cases, these agreements included stipulations about political alliances, promises of military support, trade privileges, or succession rights that could shape the fate of entire territories. Even among common folk, where literacy was rare, oral contracts were recited before witnesses, often in the presence of the parish priest, and the agreed terms were remembered and upheld by the community's collective memory. The dowry itself was more than a financial transaction. It was a statement of the bride's worth and her family's standing. For wealthy brides, it might include finely woven linens, silverware, or jewelry, in addition to land or money. In rural villages, a dowry could consist of a cow, a few goats, and chests of household goods, items essential for setting up a new home. Sometimes, symbolic objects were added: a loaf of bread to ensure plenty, a candle to light the household's path, or a spindle to remind the bride of her domestic duties. In certain traditions, the groom's family would reciprocate with gifts or resources, symbolizing their commitment to support the bride. These exchanges were often public, staged to emphasize transparency and good faith, but they could also be the source of disputes if either side failed to deliver what was promised. Political marriages were a distinct realm of their own. Among kings, princes, and lords, a wedding could mark the end of a war, the sealing of a treaty, or the beginning of a new alliance. The bride and groom, in such cases, might meet for the first time on the day of their wedding, their personal feelings irrelevant to the strategic aims of their families. Chroniclers recorded such unions in the same breath as political events, for in the medieval worldview, the marriage of two houses was as significant as the signing of a peace accord. This did not mean, however, that affection could not grow from these arranged beginnings, but the initial impetus was rarely personal. Marriages between merchant families could be equally strategic, especially in growing cities. A union might grant access to new trade routes, guild members, hips, or lucrative markets, strengthening both households. In such cases, the wedding feast could double as a business meeting, with deals struck between toasts and dances. The public face of these unions was joy and celebration, but beneath it lay a network of debts, promises, and expectations that would bind the families together for decades. It was understood that marriage was not merely a private relationship, it was a legal and economic institution, a tool for consolidating wealth, power, and influence. And yet, amid the calculations, there were moments of genuine tenderness, laughter, and hope. For even in the most calculated matches, the couple themselves stood at the center, tasked with turning obligation into partnership and perhaps, if fortune was kind, into love. Not every medieval marriage fulfilled the bright promises spoken on the wedding day, and not every alliance forged through vows endured the test of time. Some unions collapsed under the weight of personal incompatibility, others unraveled because the delicate balance of political agreements was broken, and in certain cases, a marriage that had been meant to seal peace instead became the spark for open conflict. Among the nobility, annulments were possible but complicated, often requiring intervention from the church, which viewed marriage as a sacrament not to be dissolved lightly. Valid grounds for annulment included proof that the marriage had not been consummated, evidence of a pre-existing betrothal to another, close blood relation that had been undisclosed, or coercion at the time of vows. While these might seem strict, they were sometimes creatively interpreted to allow powerful families to rearrange alliances when it suited them. In dramatic cases, annulments were pursued with public accusations. Claims of impotence, infidelity, or witchcraft could be aired before clerical courts, tarnishing reputations in the process. For commoners, separation was rare and often unofficial, with couples living apart but remaining legally bound, since divorce in the modern sense was nearly unheard of. Betrayal within marriage, especially in noble households, could lead to consequences far beyond personal heartbreak. A bride accused of adultery might be sent back to her family in disgrace or confined to a convent for life, while a groom who violated his vows could face political fallout, especially if his actions offended the bride's kin. In the most extreme scenarios, marital disputes ignited larger feuds. One famous example comes from the tangled politics of medieval France, where a broken betrothal between noble houses escalated into a series of retaliatory raids and sieges, pulling entire regions into years of hostility. Even when open warfare was avoided, the collapse of a marriage could shift the balance of power in subtle but lasting ways, changing trade agreements, inheritance lines, or loyalties in courtly politics. Public scandal was another hazard. In towns and villages, gossip was swift and merciless, and a failed marriage could become the subject of songs, jests, or cruel rhymes. Charivari, once intended as a joyful noise to ward off evil spirits, could turn into a form of ridicule, with villagers gathering outside the home of an estranged couple to mock them with noise and crude performances. This communal shaming reinforced the idea that marriage was not just a private matter but a public contract, and breaking it meant disappointing the entire community. Yet there were also instances when the breakdown of a union was quietly accepted, especially if both parties agreed to part and the separation served mutual interests. In such cases, the couple might continue to support each other's families in certain matters, even remarrying strategically to other partners without lingering hostility. Still, the enduring lesson from these failed unions was clear in the medieval mind. A wedding was not simply the start of a love story, it was the forging of a link in the chain of society. When that link snapped, the reverberations were felt far beyond the walls of the marriage bed, shaking alliances, fortunes, and reputations alike. If one were to strip away the music, the feast, and the chatter of guests, what remained at the core of a medieval wedding was the religious rite, the moment when the union was sanctified not only before men, but, in the belief of the time, before God himself. In much of medieval Europe, marriage was considered a sacred covenant, and as such, it could not be valid without the blessing of the Church, though the exact form and requirements varied across regions and centuries. In early medieval times, the ceremony might be conducted at the door of the parish church, a liminal space between the outside world and the sanctified interior, symbolizing the transition from separate lives into a shared spiritual household. The priest would meet the couple there, reciting prayers, sometimes in Latin that neither bride nor groom fully understood, but whose cadence and solemnity conveyed the gravity of the moment. In later periods, especially from the 13th century onward, the practice shifted toward holding the vows within the nave of the church, often before the altar, where the couple would stand surrounded by flickering candlelight and the scent of incense. The words spoken, whether a formal liturgical formula or a vernacular exchange of consent, were believed to bind not just the bodies, but the souls of the bride and groom. Consent was central. Canon law held that the mutual agreement of the couple was the foundation of a valid marriage, a concept that, in theory, gave both bride and groom agency, though in practice, family pressure and arranged matches meant that this consent was not always freely given. The church's role extended beyond the vows. Priests were expected to announce the band's public declarations of the intended marriage on 3 successive Sundays before the ceremony. This gave the community a chance to voice any legal or moral impediments, such as kinship too close to allow marriage under church law, or a prior betrothal that would invalidate the new union. On the day itself, the couple might be sprinkled with holy water, their hands joined under a stole or a piece of cloth as the priest invoked blessings for fertility, fidelity, and mutual support. In some places, a ceremonial kiss would follow, not the romantic gesture imagined today, but a ritual seal of the vows, sometimes mediated by a shared chalice of wine. Music within the church, when permitted, was restrained and sacred plainchant, organ tones or psalms contrasting with the lively dances and songs that would follow at the feast. Yet even in the sacred space, elements of local tradition crept in. In parts of France and Italy, brides might carry herbs believed to ward off envy, or the couple might walk a short procession around the altar as a symbol of their journey together. In the Orthodox traditions of Eastern Europe, crowns or wreaths were placed upon the heads of the bride and groom, symbolizing their role as king and queen of their household, and they would sip wine from the same cup as part of the common cup ritual, signifying the joys and sorrows they would now share. The church also imposed moral expectations through the wedding rite. Priests often delivered homilies reminding couples of their duties, the husband to protect and provide, the wife to obey and manage the household, both to raise children in the faith. These sermons could be stern, even admonitory, warning against infidelity, idleness, or neglect of prayer. In some cases, these warnings were public enough to serve as reminders to the entire congregation of the virtues expected in married life. The religious aspect also extended into the timing of weddings. Certain seasons were considered inappropriate for marriage. Lent and Advent, for example, were times of penitence, not celebration, and couples who married during these periods without dispensation risked censure. Even the hour of the ceremony could be prescribed, with mornings preferred so the couple could begin their married life in the light of day. To the medieval mind, the church's presence in the wedding was not an intrusion but a safeguard. Without its blessing, a union could be seen as incomplete, lacking divine sanction, and vulnerable to both earthly and spiritual misfortune. Thus, however joyful the feast to come, however eager the families for the alliances formed, the heart of the wedding remained in that quiet, candlelit moment when two voices spoke words that would echo, in faith and in law, for the rest of their days. Beyond the spoken vows and the priest's blessing, medieval weddings were saturated with layers of symbolism, ritual gestures, sacred objects, and ancient customs woven into the Christian rite. Some so old that their origins were half forgotten even by those performing them. The joining of hands, for instance, known in Latin as manusiunctio, was more than a polite clasp. It was a public pledge, a sealing of the covenant. And in some regions, the priest or a family elder would wrap the couple's hands with a length of cloth or ribbon, a symbolic binding that gave rise to the later phrase, tying the knot. The rings, when used, were themselves a potent symbol. In early medieval Europe, a ring might be a simple band of iron, signifying strength and permanence, though the wealthy preferred gold set with precious stones. The circular form, without beginning or end, echoed the eternal nature of the vows, while the choice of finger, the third of the left hand, was linked to the ancient belief that a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. In some traditions, the groom would place the ring on 3 fingers, in turn the thumb, the index, and finally the ring finger, reciting, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," a fusion of faith and symbolism. Certain ceremonies also involved the presentation of bread, salt, or wine. Bread represented sustenance, salt purity and preservation, wine joy and abundance. Together, they formed a miniature promise that the new household would have enough to eat, remain undefiled by scandal, and know moments of gladness. In rural areas, neighbors might bring gifts of grain, eggs, or cheese to the wedding, not only as offerings of goodwill but as tangible investments in the couple's future prosperity. The religious imagery extended into the clothing worn for the ceremony. While not every bride wore white indeed, in much of the Middle Ages, blue was associated with purity, and the Virgin Mary garments were chosen with symbolic care. Embroidered motifs might carry blessings or protective charms, and in some regions, the bride's veil was believed to shield her from evil spirits. In wealthier families, fabrics such as silk, brocade, or fine wool might be imported from distant lands, their very presence in the ceremony a testament to the groom's ability to provide. After the church service, the blessing did not end. It flowed into the post-wedding rites. In many places, the couple would be led in procession from the church to their home, accompanied by musicians, singers, and a throng of neighbors. This was not simply a joyful parade, it was a symbolic escort, a communal act of protection and welcome. At the threshold, the couple might be sprinkled again with holy water, or have grains thrown over them to invite fertility. In some areas, the groom would carry the bride over the doorway, a gesture that was part practicality, avoiding tripping on the threshold, which could be seen as a bad omen and part ritual, ensuring that no lurking spirits from the outside world could cling to her feet and enter the household. Another widespread custom was the blessing of the marriage bed. Though often imagined with scandalous overtones in later literature, in practice this was a solemn act. Elders or even clergy might visit the couple's chamber to pray for fertility, harmony, and mutual respect. In noble households, witnesses might remain until the marriage was formally consummated, their role less about voyeurism than about ensuring the union was beyond legal dispute. In villages, neighbors might stage playful interruptions, known in France as charivari or in England as rough music, banging pots and pans outside the home to embarrass the newlyweds and ensure they would remember their place in the community. All of these acts, serious or lighthearted, were embedded in a worldview where marriage was not a private escape but a public institution, one in which every gesture carried weight. To be married in the medieval sense was to step into a role recognized by both heaven and earth, a role bound by oaths, guarded by custom, and watched over by the eyes of the entire community. If the church rite was the solemn heart of the wedding, the feast that followed was its beating pulse, loud, vivid, and full of meanings that went far beyond simple indulgence. In the medieval world, a wedding banquet was not only a celebration of the couple's union, but also a public display of wealth, hospitality, and alliances. For the nobility, it was a chance to impress both allies and rivals, to demonstrate the resources and refinement of the household. For common folk, it was a rare moment when the community gathered in joy, with food and drink flowing more freely than on most other days of the year. The menu itself told a story. In wealthy halls, roasted swans might be brought in with gilded beaks, peacocks served with feathers reattached for spectacle, or intricate sugar sculptures displayed as centerpieces. Spices, cinnamon, cloves, saffron were treasured imports from far-off lands, their presence a sign of the host's trade connections and affluence. For the less affluent, the feast might center on roasted meats from a recently slaughtered pig or lamb, hearty stews, fresh bread baked that morning, and seasonal vegetables from the fields. Ale and mead flow freely, and in regions with access to vineyards, wine was poured for honored guests. Seating arrangements at the feast reflected the hierarchy of medieval society. The high table, placed on a dais, was reserved for the bride, groom, and the most distinguished guests, lords, clergy, or important kin, while lower tables extended into the hall for the rest. Proximity to the high table was both a privilege and a signal of one's standing. Music played throughout, performed by minstrels or local musicians, sometimes joined by jugglers, dancers, or storytellers who wove tales of love, chivalry, or legendary heroes to entertain the crowd. Between courses, guests might participate in toasts or blessings, lifting their cups to wish the couple long life, many children, and mutual fidelity. Some regions embrace symbolic games during the feast. In parts of France, the couple might be challenged to eat from the same plate or drink from the same goblet, a gesture reinforcing unity. In certain German towns, a log would be placed before the couple, and they would saw it in half together, symbolizing the work and cooperation required in married life. Gifts presented at the feast were practical as well as symbolic: linen for the household, tools for farming, livestock to start a herd. In noble circles, these might be elaborate treasures, embroidered tapestries, fine goblets, or even land deeds sealed during the celebration. As the night deepened, the tone of the feast often shifted from formal to raucous. Songs grew earthier, dances livelier, and the line between honored guest and exuberant participant blurred. In some traditions, the community would escort the couple to their chamber in a noisy procession, lighting the way with torches and singing bawdy verses. While this might seem intrusive by modern standards, it was both a safeguard and a celebration, ensuring the couple reached their bed without harm and with the good wishes sometimes loudly voiced of their neighbors. Even the dishes served at the end of the night could carry symbolic weight. Sweet desserts, like spiced honey cakes or almond pastries, were not only a luxury but a hopeful omen, wishing the couple's married life to be sweet in both fortune and affection. Leftover food was often distributed among the poorer members of the community, turning the wedding into an act of charity as well as festivity. When dawn came, the last embers of the feast might still glow, and the couple's new life began with the memory of a night where vows were not just witnessed in church, but celebrated, affirmed, and embedded in the collective memory of the community. In the medieval mind, such a celebration was not mere extravagance. It was the visible, audible, and tangible proof that a union had been blessed by heaven, acknowledged by society, and bound into the chain of shared life that stretched across generations. Marriage, in the medieval world, was rarely a matter of the heart alone. It was a strategic tool wielded by kings, lords, and even ambitious merchants to secure power, wealth, and influence. For the ruling elite, A wedding could seal a peace treaty more effectively than months of negotiation, forge alliances that stretched across continents, or bring disputed lands under one crown without the bloodshed of battle. When a king married the daughter of a neighboring monarch, it was not simply a union of two people. It was the merging of two dynasties, the blending of claims, and often the quiet rewriting of borders on maps. Dowries played a central role in this political game. A dowry was more than a gift, it was a calculated transfer of wealth, land, or privileges meant to cement the alliance. A princess might arrive at her husband's court with caskets of gold, precious textiles, and fine horses, but also with legal rights to territories her family controlled. In return, the groom's family might grant her security in the form of dower lands property she could claim for her livelihood if she were widowed. These exchanges were often meticulously detailed in marriage contracts, witnessed by clerics and nobles, sealed with wax, and sometimes negotiated for years before the couple ever met. For the merchant class, marriage alliances could open trade routes, secure monopolies, or join two rival guilds into one powerful force. A prosperous cloth merchant might wed his daughter to the son of a spice trader, ensuring that their family's businesses would feed into each other, their fortunes intertwined. Even in rural communities, marriage could consolidate farms, join herds, and strengthen a family's claim to valuable pasture or water rights. Sometimes these arrangements placed young brides and grooms in unions where affection was an afterthought. Noble children might be betrothed as early as infancy, their fates decided by parents eager to secure advantageous matches. In extreme cases, the couple might not meet until the wedding day, stepping into a partnership already loaded with expectations and obligations. In such politically sensitive unions often became turning points for conflict, and if one side failed to fulfill promised lands or payments, or if an alliance no longer matched the climate of power, a marriage could rapidly deteriorate, leading to formal annulments, accusations of broken trust, or even armed disputes. In 12th century Europe, the union of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France was meant to unite vast territories, but political and personal strains led to its end, after which Eleanor's marriage to Henry II of England shifted the balance of influence dramatically, sparking decades of rivalry between England and France. Royal weddings were staged with deliberate magnificence, the spectacle serving as a form of political display, with every jewel, every seat, and every song chosen to convey strength, unity, and legitimacy. Foreign envoys were often invited to witness the wealth and stability of the realm, their reports shaping diplomatic impressions abroad. For common people, these events offered a rare glimpse of courtly grandeur and a chance to affirm loyalty to their rulers, even if their own unions were far more modest. Across all classes, one truth remained. Marriage was a binding contract with consequences reaching far beyond personal life. In the medieval view, the personal was political, and the wedding altar could serve as a decisive arena much like a battlefield. If marriages could forge empires, they could dismantle them just as easily. And behind the ornate scenes of medieval celebrations often lay currents of intrigue, distrust, and secret maneuvering. Alliances formed in celebration could fracture under shifting political winds, and matrimonial bonds were not immune to ambition's sharp edges. It was not unusual for envoys or courtiers to quietly observe who spoke to whom, which families were aligned, and which groups were conspicuously absent, then carry these details back to foreign courts for strategic use. Some marriages were arranged with an unspoken understanding that they would be temporary, useful while treaties were signed or rivals distracted, and later dissolved for reasons such as close kinship or personal incompatibility, each claim chosen to avoid open accusations of bad faith while ending the union. Private, unauthorized marriages brought further instability, as when King Edward IV of England's undisclosed marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 disrupted diplomatic negotiations and contributed to rivalries that shaped the Wars of the Roses. Unions meant to unite powerful houses could instead foster resentment if agreed resources failed to arrive or promised military aid never came. sometimes through deliberate interference by opponents seeking to weaken the alliance. Even in such contexts, sudden illnesses or unexplained accidents involving influential spouses were recorded in chronicles, leaving contemporaries to speculate about their cause. The marital chamber itself could be a place of political significance, as producing heirs was not simply a family matter but a necessity for stability, and failure in this regard could unsettle entire realms. In many instances, the absence of an heir led to speculation and careful political maneuvering. For those seeking influence at court, such circumstances could create opportunities to advance their own position. Yet, despite these challenges, numerous medieval unions, particularly among the most prominent families, endured not from mutual affection, but from shared strategic purpose. In this environment, couples often worked together to maintain stability, presenting unity in public while managing private disagreements discreetly. History provides many cases where a marriage intended to strengthen peace instead altered political landscapes in unforeseen ways. The marriage of Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, to Edward II of England in 1308, aimed to solidify harmony between England and France. However, shifting priorities, disagreements, and reliance on certain advisors led to tensions, and the eventual political changes that followed reshaped relations between the two kingdoms. Similarly, the 1565 union of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lord Darnley brought together strong claims to the English crown, creating concerns for Queen Elizabeth I. While initially a significant alliance, the relationship soon faced difficulties that affected both internal politics and diplomatic strategies. Earlier, in the late 12th century, the marriage of Constance of Sicily to Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, brought Sicily into the imperial sphere, provoking resistance from regional leaders and leading to extended negotiations involving the papacy. In other cases, ambition drove unions whose consequences reached far beyond the wedding day. The 1469 marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united two major Spanish realms, enabling significant territorial consolidation. This alliance influenced the direction of European politics for decades, as other powers adjusted to the new balance. Not all such unions resulted in open conflict, but many had long-term effects. Some peace agreements tied to marriages lasted only during the lifetimes of the rulers involved, with disputes emerging among successors. Others deepened divisions by excluding certain influential families, increasing the likelihood of future rivalries. These examples show that in the medieval world, the marriage ceremony could carry as much political weight as any formal treaty. Vows spoken before witnesses held both symbolic and legal significance, often serving as calculated moves in a complex political arena. For those skilled in this environment, marriage could be a tool capable of expanding influence without military action, or, in other cases, leading to political shifts that transformed entire regions. Beyond the public celebrations and diplomatic exchanges, there was also a more private aspect to these events: the wedding night. In the medieval perspective, this was considered the moment when the agreement was fully realized. In the households of the nobility, this occasion sometimes involved ceremonial customs observed by selected members of the court. These attendants might accompany the couple to ensure traditions were followed, while the room itself was arranged with symbolic details such as fine textiles, decorative greenery, and items representing abundance. In some traditions, blessings were spoken, and symbolic markings were placed to encourage prosperity and protection for the new household. Tie charms were not uncommon amulets sewn into the mattress, sprigs of rosemary or rue tucked under pillows, or coins hidden in the sheets to encourage prosperity. In parts of France and Italy, the newlyweds might share a symbolic meal in the bedchamber, honeyed almonds, figs, or eggs, foods believed to stir passion and promote conception. Yet, for all the romance implied, the wedding night could be fraught with anxiety, particularly for young brides who often entered marriage with little to no understanding of intimacy. In noble alliances, where heirs were the lifeblood of dynastic continuity, The pressure to conceive began immediately. The absence of children within the first year could provoke speculation, court gossip, and even political tension. In some courts, the consummation was so crucial that physical proof blood-stained sheets was expected as evidence of the bride's virginity, a practice that could humiliate and endanger women if the marriage was not consummated as expected. This obsession with proof sometimes led to deception. Servants might stain linens with animal blood to protect a bride's reputation, or couples might pretend the act had been completed to avoid scandal while privately delaying intimacy. In rural communities, customs surrounding the wedding night could be more boisterous. Guests might escort the couple to their home with music, shouting blessings or teasing jokes through the door. In some regions, it was tradition for friends to bang on pots and pans outside the couple's window, a noisy display meant to drive away bad luck and ensure a healthy marriage. Whether in a castle chamber or a peasant's cottage, the wedding night was steeped in ritual and expectation, a moment where private desire and public duty intersected. It was, in many ways, the most symbolic chapter of the marriage, one that could shape the reputation, stability, and future of the union from its very first hours. Across medieval Europe, the wedding night was not left entirely to chance or private emotion. In a world where fertility, lineage, and divine favor were tightly interwoven, couples and their families turned to an intricate web of symbols, amulets, and rituals intended to secure a prosperous union. Some of these practices had roots in ancient pagan traditions, later adapted or tolerated within a Christian framework. In the colder reaches of Scandinavia, it was common for a bride to carry small iron charms shaped like hammers, invoking the protection of Thor, not only to guard against evil spirits, but also to ensure strength and virility in the marriage. Even centuries after Christianization, these charms appeared, discreetly sewn into hems or hidden beneath bedpillows. In the Germanic regions, sprigs of juniper, rowan, or hawthorn might be hung above the bed to repel malevolent forces. These plants were believed to possess strong protective energies, their sharp scents and thorny branches acting as deterrents to witches or ill-wishers. In the Mediterranean, the influence of classical antiquity lingered. Couples in southern Italy might place pomegranates on the wedding table or within sight of the bed, their many seeds a potent emblem of fertility and abundance. In Greece, small statuettes of Aphrodite or fertility goddesses could be kept in the bridal chamber not for open worship, but as a quiet inheritance of ancient beliefs, carried forward in the hope of fruitful union. Christian symbolism also infused the night. Crosses carved into the bed frame, blessed candles burning until the couple fell asleep, and whispered prayers to saints associated with marriage such as Saint Valentine or Saint Agnes were intended to sanctify the act itself. In some noble households, relics were brought into the bedchamber, a fragment of a saint's garment, a vial of holy oil, or a scrap of parchment inscribed with scripture. These were thought to lend spiritual protection, particularly in cases where the match was politically sensitive and the production of an heir urgent. Folk magic and superstition filled the gaps where formal religion left questions unanswered. In rural France, the bride might drink a cup of milk with crushed herbs before the wedding night, a charm to ensure easy conception. In parts of the British Isles, a groom's shoe might be placed under the bed to trap good fortune, while in the Balkans, brides sometimes wore a red ribbon around the waist beneath their gown to guard against the evil eye. The layering of symbols, Christian, pagan, and local, created a tapestry of meaning that transformed the wedding night into a carefully orchestrated ritual of protection, desire, and hope. Every charm tucked into a sheet, every prayer murmured in the dark, every plant hung above a doorway reflected a shared understanding. The union of two people was not simply a personal milestone, but a moment that could ripple through generations. While most charms and rituals surrounding the medieval wedding night passed quietly within households, there were moments when these practices erupted into public scandal or drew the sharp attention of the church. In an age where religious orthodoxy was gaining ever greater control over private life, the discovery of certain amulets, prayers, or symbolic acts could be interpreted as witchcraft, heresy, or even demonic invocation. One documented case from 14th century France involved a noble bride whose family placed a carved ivory figurine of Venus beneath her pillow on her wedding night. The figure had been handed down for generations as a fertility talisman, but when a servant revealed its presence to a local priest, the object was seized, denounced as pagan, and publicly destroyed. The bride's family was forced to make a donation to the church as penance, though behind closed doors they replaced the destroyed figurine with a hidden replica. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, bishops occasionally ordered investigations into improper wedding blessings. Records survive of a small Bavarian village where a newlywed couple was accused of invoking forest spirits for fertility. Witnesses claimed they saw the bride and groom circle an oak tree under moonlight before entering their home. The couple was summoned before an ecclesiastical court, where they defended themselves by saying it was an old village custom. The court ruled it superstitious, and the local priest was instructed to conduct a formal blessing of their marriage bed to overwrite any pagan influence. Scandals could also emerge when fertility rituals clashed with politics. In a 15th century Italian city-state, a young bride from a powerful merchant family was accused by her husband's relatives of slipping a red silk cord woven with strands of her own hair around his waist as he slept on their wedding night. This act, meant as a binding charm to secure his fidelity, was painted by her enemies as an attempt to enslave him through sorcery. Though no formal charges were brought, the tension between the two families escalated into open hostility, altering the city's political alliances for years. Even the symbolism of certain foods could cause controversy. In England, a noble couple once hosted a private feast of roasted hare and pomegranate wine in the bridal chamber. While seemingly harmless, the hare was locally linked to ancient fertility rites, and a bishop condemned the meal as heathen excess. The couple escaped censure, but were whispered about for the rest of their lives. These incidents reveal that the wedding night was never entirely safe from outside judgment. While most charms and customs were accepted as harmless, the wrong symbol in the wrong context could be enough to tarnish a family's honor, or invite suspicion from both church and community. In the delicate balance of medieval life, where reputation was as fragile as glass, even the most intimate rituals could become weapons in the hands of rivals, or tools for asserting religious control over the private realm. When the wedding feast was over, the vows exchanged, and the bed blessed or otherwise prepared, the medieval couple's story did not end there. In modern times, the idea of a honeymoon often conjures images of secluded retreats, shared adventures, or quiet days of romance. In the Middle Ages, however, the period following the wedding, if it could be called a honeymoon at all, was rarely a private escape. Instead, it was a time bound by duties, visits, public appearances, and in many cases, political obligations. The word honeymoon itself, or its earlier forms, came from the tradition of drinking mead honey wine during the first month of marriage, a practice rooted in older Germanic and Norse customs. Mead was believed to encourage fertility, strengthen health, and bring good fortune to the couple. And in some regions, it was the responsibility of the groom's family to provide enough of it for 30 days. This was not just symbolic, it was a tangible reminder to the community that the union was meant to produce heirs and prosperity. For the nobility, the weeks following the wedding were often filled with public processions and receptions in various estates. Newlyweds might be expected to visit important relatives, vassals, or allied lords to affirm the marriage alliance. These journeys were not leisurely, they were orchestrated displays of unity and power, where every meal, gift exchange, and ceremony reinforced the bond between families. The bride, often new to her husband's lands, would be formally introduced to the household staff, local clergy, and tenants. Each introduction was a moment of subtle evaluation, as those who served her husband would now serve her as well, and her demeanor during these first encounters could shape her reputation for years to come. In rural communities, the honeymoon was even more public. Friends and neighbors might continue to visit the couple for days after the wedding, bringing food, small gifts, or even livestock, as tribute, ions to their household. These visits were opportunities for the community to celebrate, but also to observe, ensuring that the couple was settling into married life as expected. Privacy was a rare luxury. For royal marriages, the weeks after the wedding could be consumed by ceremonial duties. In some courts, the queen or noble bride might have to host banquets or attend religious processions almost immediately after the marriage, often with little time to rest. Some historical accounts describe brides who traveled long distances to meet their husbands, only to be swept into a cycle of public appearances before they had fully recovered from the journey or the wedding festivities. The expectation of fertility shadowed these early days. In many households, there were subtle or sometimes overt checks to see if the bride showed signs of pregnancy. For the highest ranks of society, envoys and chroniclers might note when the couple was last seen together, turning the most private aspects of marriage into matters of public record. What might have been imagined as a month of joy and intimacy was, for many medieval couples, a carefully managed transition into shared duty, where love, if it existed, had to find space within the rigid framework of social expectation. If the newlyweds were to travel after the wedding, the journey itself became an extension of the ceremony, carrying with it layers of symbolism, custom, and spectacle. In an age when roads were unreliable and travel was slow, the movement of a married couple from one estate to another or from the bride's family home to the groom's lands was never a simple relocation. It was a public statement of alliances forged, dowries delivered, and futures intertwined. For nobles, the departure from the bride's home was often staged as a grand procession. Horses were adorned with ribbons, bells, and embroidered caparisons in the colors of both families. The bride might ride beneath a canopy held aloft by retainers, a symbol of honor and protection, while musicians played pipes, drums, or lutes to announce the journey to every village they passed. In some regions, peasants lined the roads to witness the procession, throwing flowers, herbs, or even grain into the path of the riders as blessings for fertility and abundance. Such acts were more than gestures. They were deeply rooted in agricultural symbolism, linking the union of two people to the health of the land itself. The objects carried along the journey also held meaning. The bride's dowry chests, often elaborately painted or carved, were loaded onto carts, displaying not just wealth, but the promise of stability and provision in the new household. Some contained practical items, linen, tableware, tools, while others held symbolic ones, such as candlesticks to bring light into the marriage, or salt to protect against misfortune. In certain parts of Eastern Europe, a loaf of bread wrapped in a fine cloth was carried at the front of the procession to ensure that the couple would never go hungry. For royal or high-ranking couples, the journey could be accompanied by armed escorts and heralds who carried banners displaying family crests. These banners, fluttering above the road, served both as a warning to would-be bandits and as a proclamation of the alliance to all who saw them. In some cases, the route itself was carefully chosen to pass through politically important territories, allowing the couple to be seen by as many subjects as possible. Even the stops along the way were opportunities for ritual. Inns, monasteries, or the homes of allied nobles might prepare feasts in the couple's honor, each meal punctuated with toasts to their health, prosperity, and most importantly, in the medieval worldview, the hope for many children. In smaller villages, locals might perform folk dances or recite blessings, sometimes blending Christian prayers with older, pre-Christian charms. The journey's end often marked the bride's formal arrival into her new household. Here, another set of customs awaited, crossing the threshold sometimes literally carried by her husband to avoid bad luck, lighting a new fire in the hearth, or receiving a symbolic key to the storerooms or wine cellar. These acts signified the transfer of responsibility and authority, binding her to the rhythms and fortunes of her new home. In every step, from the first mile to the final door, the medieval wedding journey was a tapestry woven from politics, faith, and community expectation. The conclusion of what we might call the medieval honeymoon was rarely marked by a moment of quiet reflection. Instead, it faded into the unbroken stream of duties, expectations, and, in some cases, trials that would test the new marriage almost immediately. In noble and royal households, the end of the post-wedding celebrations often meant the beginning of court life in full force. The bride, now firmly settled into her husband's estate or palace, would be expected to take up her role as hostess, managing receptions, overseeing household staff, and ensuring the proper etiquette was observed during every gathering. In many cases, she had to navigate the delicate web of court politics, where alliances shifted quickly, and every word or gesture could be interpreted as a statement of loyalty or ambition. For couples in the countryside, the first weeks after the ceremonial period brought a swift return to the realities of survival. Autumn marriages meant preparing for winter, storing food, securing fuel, and ensuring livestock was ready for the cold months ahead. Spring weddings were followed by planting, an equally demanding season. For these households, the transition from celebration to work was abrupt. There was no lingering in leisure. And yet, even in these practical rhythms, the union was under constant observation. Families, servants, and in some cases entire communities kept a watchful eye for signs of harmony or discord. A bride's ability to adapt to her new environment was scrutinized, as was the groom's attentiveness or authority. Disagreements, if noticed too early, could lead to gossip that would tarnish reputations for years. The expectation of producing children hung heavily over the couple, especially in the upper classes, where heirs were crucial for inheritance and political stability. If a pregnancy did not appear within the first year, whispers could begin, sometimes blaming the bride, sometimes the groom, and sometimes speculating on divine displeasure. Remedies, charms, and medical consultations might follow, blurring the line between superstition and genuine medical practice of the era. For some, the first months brought genuine companionship and the beginnings of a partnership that could weather the demands of their time. For others, especially in marriages arranged for political or economic gain, the honeymoon period was a mere illusion, quickly replaced by cold formality or open hostility. Historical letters and diaries reveal moments of deep affection, but also of isolation, disappointment, and even fear. In the eyes of medieval society, however, the private truth mattered less than the public appearance. A marriage was successful if it fulfilled its role, securing alliances, managing property, producing heirs, and maintaining the outward image of stability. The wedding, the feast, the journey, all of it was only the prelude. The true test of a medieval marriage began in the quiet spaces between public duties, where two people, bound by law, faith, and expectation, had to find a way to live together within the intricate, often unforgiving framework of their world.